It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Harry Kuchah Kuchah. Harry is a lecturer in language education at the University of Leeds, and he has also been involved in a range of teacher education and materials development initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe. More recently, he has served as a consultant with the Council of Europe in Albania, with Windle Trust International in South Sudan, and with the British Council in Afghanistan, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, and Senegal. Harry was recognised as one of TESOL International Association's 30 upcoming leaders in ELT globally in 2016. He's currently president of IATEFL, joint coordinator of the Teaching English in Large Classes International Network, and is a member of the British Council English Language Advisory Group. His research interests include teaching English to young learners, English medium education, language teacher education, and context-appropriate pedagogies, and he's published in all of these areas. So without further ado, over to you, Harry.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I hope I can be seen now. I hope I have not pressed the wrong button. I'm not very high tech, so I do tend to make some real big mistakes. Am I okay to go then?
You are indeed, Harry. Carry on.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be talking at this session, at this event. And this is kind of a follow-up to a presentation I did at the previous Cambridge event, but this time I'm trying to illustrate with examples, and I'm hoping that at the end of my session, our participants will be able to make sense of the ideas that I want to share. So I'm looking at learning and the expertise of learners. And I'm trying to look at ways in which we can not just acknowledge, but develop that expertise, because I think from my own experience and research that developing learners' expertise in a way will help us as teachers partner with our learners and facilitate the work we do, because like we know, probably we all probably agree on one thing, that there can be no effective teaching if effective learning doesn't happen. So in this session, I'm drawing from my own experience of working and researching young learners in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but also from the experience that I've drawn from working with teachers from different parts of the world, especially from the global South. And in this context, the traditional focus, and I think that's something that's fairly the same in many parts of the world, we do tend to focus a lot on teaching methods, and initial teacher education focuses on teaching methods and techniques and theories of teaching and learning, materials and curriculum and syllabus design, and sometimes classroom conditions, as would be the case in those contexts which have been termed difficult contexts because of all sorts of resource challenges that they have. But often the discussion doesn't center on the learner. Though we talk about learner-centered pedagogies, learner-centered approach to teaching, very rarely do we see that focus on learners and learners' input to the debates. I was talking about the place of learners, the importance of learners in thinking about policy and practice. And the fact that my argument would be that it's not just enough to hear students' voices, learners' voices, but it's actually consistent with learner-centered approaches to education that we do include students' perspectives and their voices in the design of policy in relation to curriculum, but also in relation to pedagogic practice. Because students come to our classrooms with their emotions, their interests, their learning styles, their experiences from home, from society that can enrich classroom practices. They come with their dreams, their aspirations, and they come with resources. And this could be learning resources, this could be linguistic resources, this could be experiences or resources from their communication with parents and grandparents. So to bring all this knowledge into the classroom. And so it's important that their voices play an important role in the decisions we take. And to achieve that, I think we need to think about involving them, engaging them, and building their sense of agency. Because in doing this, we are able to make learning more reflective of students' input, but also make learning more meaningful to them. Because of course, they are the masters of learning. They are the ones who know what good learning is. We teach, we can teach, but if learning doesn't occur, there is a problem. So an example that I found from my own research is working with young learners was in the project which I'm showing here. I was asking students, 11-year-olds, to reflect on the teaching of their teachers. And this was specifically in relation to English language. So we were doing lots of different activities, including together observing the teacher in their class and talking about that particular lesson after the class, but also looking at their exercise books and looking at work that they had done for the term and asking children to identify their best English language lesson as a starting point for discussing how the teacher taught that lesson and what they thought about the teacher's practices. In this example, the student is showing me a lesson in which they scored a 0 in the practice exercise. And when I asked them why this is their best lesson, their explanation is that when the teacher explained what they should do, they didn't understand, and so they failed. But much later, they talked with another friend, a classmate, and it's from talking to the classmate that they understood what to do. And Lydia here is telling me, well, now I can do it really well because my friend explained it to me. Now, in the next example, we are talking about a lesson that we've just observed. Their teacher has just taught them a reading lesson, and the students were not very active. So I asked them, but why were you not active? And they said, well, the story was not interesting. If the teacher liked, if the teacher asked us, we would have written a better story than the one in the textbook. And so in the conversation, I realized that the students seem to be able not just to talk about teachers' own practices, but to be able to talk about the materials. They have an opinion about the materials in relation to how interesting the textbook materials might be for them. And one of them, Lydia, again tells me at the end of this conversation, look, if you like it, give us a topic and we would write a very interesting story, I swear. So that got me thinking about what exactly learner-centeredness is and how we might build on learners' sense of agency, on these skills that learners bring to the classroom, on their ability to critique the processes of teaching and the materials, how we could build on that to develop their sense of autonomy, because we need to acknowledge that these children are capable of doing a lot, or at least a bit more than what we do with them. So that brings me to my idea about learner autonomy and learner agency. I like to cite Lainey Dam's work in 2008, 2004, 2008, when she talks about the characteristics of an autonomous classroom. Lainey Dam is a long-standing classroom practitioner of learner autonomy. And she looks at different aspects. She looks at the physical frame or setting. So according to Lainey Dam, we can identify an autonomous classroom from the physical frame or setting, but even more importantly, from the issues and the ongoing activities and processes in the classroom. Now, in relation to the physical frame, it's quite straightforward. So we can see learners working in groups. That doesn't mean that all group work is actually autonomous work. We can see, especially in my kinds of contexts where students group around one textbook, so they're literally reading from the same textbook, but doing individual work, except that they are in a group. So we can't really say that about group work. But she says learners are in groups. There is some intensive student activity and engagement. The learners are engaged in many different activities, and the teacher is supporting them, supporting different groups and individuals. And we might find examples of student products posted on the walls as examples of what they are doing, and that motivates them to want to have their own work on in the classroom walls. They have student logbooks or some form of document in which they reflect on the process of learning as well, etc., etc. But I want to focus more on the ongoing activities, because this actually tells us what we see at face level is actually a reflection of student involvement, student engagement, and student agency. And she talks about the role of the teachers and learners. What is the teacher's role? The teacher's role in this case would be a facilitator, and the learners are generating the activities, and the teacher spurs them to develop those activities. She also talks about learners having a say in the choice of content and learning activities. What do we want to study today? What are some of the activities that we want to engage in? Now, so I was saying what's more important to me for this talk is what Lenny Dam says about the ongoing activities and processes. And she focuses on what the teacher's role is. The teacher's role would be that of a facilitator, a motivator, someone who spurs students to engage more, but the students would also have a say in the choice of content and in the choice of learning activities. She also says we would see visible interest and engagement and satisfaction from the learners, but also there is shared responsibility, and students are able to document the processes and the products. So they're documenting what they are doing, why they are doing it, and what the outcomes are. And they're drawing from different materials, not just one standard textbook, for example. So these are some of the things that I want to talk about in the rest of this session. And I want to take us back to those kids with whom I did my research, Lydia and her friends. And I want to share some of the things that I've done with these students and other things that my colleagues in Sub-Saharan Africa have been doing with their own students, so that we can have a full picture of what I want to convey in relation to acknowledging students' expertise and developing this expertise. So in this example I want to share, when I had collected data and the students had challenged me to challenge the teacher to give them a task to write, I agreed with them that as part of my research, I was going to teach them a lesson. It ended up to be more than one lesson, though, as a way of saying thank you for participating in my research. And this was one of the examples. Initially, this text was in the textbook, adapted from Christine Nuttall's book. And the names here were adapted to the Cameroonian context. They are Cameroonian names. So I started by giving them the first line of the story and asking them to complete the story. Now, this was done in two ways. So I started with the title, A Very Bad Son. But when they had finished in their groups writing the story and reading the story, I changed the topic to A Very Good Son, because this reflected more the title of the original story in the textbook. And students then had to get back in their groups and try to rewrite their story, changing beats. Now, the reason why I did this was to get students to think very carefully about their world view of goodness and badness in relation to children, but also to engage in the text in different ways and to have ample opportunity to communicate with each other. Now, this video here, which I'll put on mute, actually shows the students working in their groups, developing their story. And you can see that everyone in the group is contributing to the story. Some of them are developing the ideas, others are helping editing the ideas, making sure that they're organizing the stories, the sequence of events is chronological. And so everyone is actively contributing in the different groups to the story that the children are writing. Now, when they had finished writing their story, we then compared that with the original text. So I want in the chat box if we could share the children's text and the final text. Not to look at it now, we will talk about that, but if that can be shared now, I'll be very grateful. So this is the original text. And as you would see later from the students' own text, their texts were very different in many ways. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But this activity involved them looking at their final story about a very good son and comparing that with the original text. And they were able to identify areas where their text was similar in content to the original text, but also areas where there were differences between their original text, and their own text. And in engaging with the two texts in this manner, they were understanding, they were developing their understanding of the original text much better. So comparing, so they were not just answering comprehension questions as the traditional teaching would look like, but they were actually engaging in comparing their text with the original text and trying to identify those similarities and differences and decoding the meaning even better of the text even better. Other things they did was that they had to set comprehension questions for each other from the text. So I didn't give them the comprehension questions from the text. I asked them to set their own comprehension questions. And if you look at the questions on the left, on the right in black, are actually questions that the students themselves set for each other. Those in blue came from the textbook. And if you look at the questions, especially question number 5 and 6 from the students' comprehension questions, these are high-level cognitive skills that are being called to play here. So in a sense, the students were engaging even more cognitively than the textbook itself was for them. So in engaging them in setting comprehension questions, I was also in bringing, making them aware of the processes that a teacher goes through to develop teaching and learning activities for them. Because when they set these questions and the different groups responded to the questions, each group had to mark the answers to the questions. And it was possible because if they set a question that was confusing. And another activity we did was that they drew stories. They had to think about the story, draw a picture of one thing that really attracts them, that they're really interested in that story. And this is an example of students drawing. And when they're drawn in their groups, each group had to then tell the story, show the picture to the classroom and tell the story, what they had drawn in their picture. Now, I must warn that this is very noisy, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to hear exactly what the girl is saying, because this will be important in understanding why their text is as long as it is and why it's complex than the original text. So please, if you can just listen and exclude the noise, it's a very noisy school, and focus on what the little girl is saying.
She was cooking while Junior and his friends were playing with the toy car. After she light on the gas and she started cooking.
Right, you would see already that there are new characters that the children have included now, because they have had time to be creative, to draw a picture and to be creative. They're now thinking of other things. They're including further content. So for example, Junior is no longer alone. He's got his friend. In the original story, we didn't see when Atangana was leaving home for work, but now in the picture, we can see Atangana is saying goodbye to his wife, etc. And later on in this story, in this picture, they are talking about a grandmother and a grandfather, and other characters are coming in. And I did encourage them then, having told their stories, to go back and add that content to their own text. Now, so if you look at, if we can just go to the text that you have now, if that's been shared, I can't see that from this end. Charlotte, can you confirm that that's been shared?
We can see your video at the moment, Harry.
Yeah, someone was going to share from Cambridge, was going to share the text, the link to the text. Has that been done?
I will just check for you. I'm sure that will be posted in the chat for you in just a second, Harry.
Okay, if you can do that. Well, because we don't have a lot of time, I would encourage colleagues to download the two versions of the story. So I've got the original version and I've got a sample of the story as written by the children. And you can see from that, that the children's, there are lots of language problems, but their story is far more complex. It's longer than the original story and it includes a lot more variety of language and use of language, things like direct and indirect speech. It includes many more characters than they are in the original story. You can download that and look at it at your own time. Now, this is an example of one of the pictures that one of the groups talked about. So in this group, they focus on the hospital scene as captured in that story and imagine what will be happening. And we use this story then with another group to ask them to not write, we use this picture to ask the other students not to write a story, but to write a fact text. And this is an example of a text that the students wrote from this picture. So they were reflecting on the importance of a hospital. But more importantly for me in this example, they were focusing on an issue within their community. So they were not just learning English, they were actually engaging in something that is relevant in their context, and that is the problem of self-medication. Many people buying medication by the roadside, expired medication sometimes. And so children were thinking about things that are happening in their society and addressing, bringing this to the classroom in a way that the textbook had not seen it, or the teacher himself might not have realized. Other things that I have done with teenage secondary level students is actually involving through the Teacher Association research project that I'm running in Cameroon, is asking teachers to work together, observing each other, engaging with each other students, collecting feedback from students and using the feedback from students to develop learning and teaching. And in this example, the teachers two teachers working with each other had the opportunity to engage with their students, to ask the students the types of topics that they wanted to be discussed in the classroom. And this is an example where the students actually wanted to talk about their environment rather than talking about war in Afghanistan, which was the text in their textbook at that time. So they were talking about the environment, and the teachers then developed lessons that help them to achieve this. And one of the things the students wanted to do was to advise the mayor of the council in the Yaoundé, that's the capital of Cameroon, about ways in which they could take care of the environment. So this is an example of the students actually writing their own letters to the mayor, but suggesting different ideas. Of course, the teachers helped them, taught them about formal letters and things like that and the language they needed. But this was important because it was helping the students to achieve something that they wanted to write about. And so they didn't just advise the mayor on what to do, they actually did some of those activities. So for example, they talked about having billboards about the environment, keeping the environment clean, but also recycling objects. And they found time to demonstrate this in the classroom. And in the example you would see here, they didn't just do those things, but they then went ahead to teach each other using language how they produced each of these objects from waste that they collected from their environment. There was also the suggestion to research local cultures. Cameroon has got so many cultures, and they wanted to research different cultures apart from their own cultures and to talk about one of their favorite cultures in Cameroon, which wasn't their culture. And so they were working in groups and researching different cultures, and writing about them. They also did transform some stories into comic strips. As you can see in this example, this is a text. This is a comic strip taken from a text in the VSO. Is it the Peace Corps Teach English, Prevent AIDS? And it's a story about a young girl who had sex early on in life, got pregnant, had a baby, and then went back to school, but then contacted HIV/AIDS and that story. So they are capturing that through comic strips and providing text, some kind of dialogue in the text. But also they had opportunity to be creative, to write music. Now this is just a little excerpt from a long text that my student brought to me to say, I can also do it. Please, sir, I can also do it. And I couldn't understand the text. So this is just a little part. And when she told me she had written a song, I was curious to hear what song they had written. And this was it. You probably know the original song. And the song would be something like, come today, join our English class, in order to be bilingual in the future. There is only one way, just to be a good Cameroonian. Make a better choice and join us today. Now, if you are of my generation, you probably know Michael Jackson's Heal the World. So this student had rewritten Michael Jackson's Heal the World to reflect their own local context and their experiences in the school environment. And other things they did were stories. So in this example, the teacher is asking them for irregular verbs, and you can see the students are doing nothing. But the teacher then moved on to ask them about a short story. Who can tell a short story? And the students are all excited. And they were telling stories. And we all know that irregular verbs love a story. Once you start a story, the story is invaded by irregular verbs. So it didn't matter whether they can name irregular verbs. It mattered whether they can tell stories and use these irregular verbs. And they did lots of them. So I'm getting to the end of my talk. I'm sorry it's been rushed because of the technical issues. So for me, when we involve learners as partners, not just as partners in thinking about the what and how of teaching and learning, this provides us opportunity or provides opportunity for more learner-learner collaboration. I think that this is very central to learner-centeredness. When we have ample opportunity for learners to collaborate with each other because they are genuinely interested in the particular activity, and that because they have proposed that activity. It enhances their negotiation of meaning. They're all playing with language, and in multilingual context, they are facing their own challenges using different forms of language, supporting each other. But we are identifying the language problems that they have, and that can help us develop specific or targeted language therapy for the different activities. And this motivates our learners. And of course, it brings out authenticity, not just in the content that they're generating, but in their learner experience, in their learning experiences, and also develops their agency and their sense of autonomy. So for me, and that would be my final slide, learner autonomy and authenticity are quite very important in the classroom. And we need to acknowledge this by opening up space for our students to engage in creative thinking. And I think competency framework captures this very well. So we want to encourage them to engage in creative thinking, where they are active participants in creative activities that help them generate new ideas with which they can solve problems, life problems, but learning problems as well. We want to encourage critical thinking, where they are able to identify specific patterns from a text, from language and relationships, and evaluating their own ideas and using this to solve real life problems. We want to help them to develop learning skills about learning how to learn, supporting each other, taking control of their learning, but also giving them the space to develop choice of language to use in different situations and to bring their linguistic resources to bear in the language classroom, but also, of course, developing collaboration skills, which are very essential for lifelong learning and for working in a social context. And that also we want to develop a sense of social responsibility where learners recognize their different roles within their groups and their different contributions. And this, in a sense, helps them develop emotionally, and those friendships, those relationships that are essential for working with each other, but for empowering themselves. And I think that this, when we achieve this, we are bringing some form of authenticity in the classroom, acknowledging learners' autonomy, their contribution, their agency, and helping them develop this further. So remember, learning is a process of active construction, and it is a social phenomenon as well as an individual experience. And learner differences and resources are not obstacles. As we have seen from these examples, they can bring different things, their creativity, into the classroom. Thank you very much. And I'm so sorry for the technical hitches.
And thank you, Harry. A huge round of applause for me for persevering through that. You did fantastically well. So we've got a few questions for you, and we've got about 8 minutes left. So let's just persevere. I don't know if you want to try and come back on camera just so we can see you again.
I will try and do that.
Let's see if we can do that. Okay, so I've got a question from Facebook. Hello. Question from Facebook. How can I get my students to feel confident in the classroom so that they can feel really creative?
Right. Now, this is a very important question. One of the problems we have is that our students come from different cultures, and very often they are being told to be quiet when an elderly person is talking, or not to critique their parents, or not to criticize parents, and things like that do impede student engagement when they get to a higher level. But again, what I would say is that we need to train our learners to be able to be active participants in the teaching and learning process. It doesn't come automatically. Cultures do stand on the way of that, but every human being has, I think, learner autonomy, I think it's David Little who says that, it's an inherent human capacity. Everybody has some sense of autonomy, but educational systems sometimes might stand on the way of that. So I think our role would be to take tiny steps, just starting by getting feedback from students. How did this go? What did you think about this? What did you enjoy about it? What would you have suggested? What could you suggest for me to do next time? And actually taking this on board and making sure you are acknowledging that what you're doing next is actually from advice that the students give you, would empower them and encourage them to take more steps. So I think it's a gradual process. It's not something that comes out of the blue. We need to take tiny steps, and students would eventually grow.
Great, okay. I think I've got time for a couple more questions. So Erica has asked the question, Harry just mentioned language therapy. I would like to ask him to talk a little bit more about what he means by language therapy.
Okay, I agree that's a confusing word, but I simply mean we tend to, in some contexts, tend to teach grammar, sometimes out of context, and I've looked at lots of grammar books. Practice exercises are often isolated grammar sentences. For example, complete the sentence with the appropriate form of the verb in brackets. And so yesterday, my mother went to the market. Question number 2, this morning I went with my friend to school, or I played football with my friend. But there's no connection between those two sentences. And we find that a lot in textbooks. But what I mean is when students engage in a creative construction of language, then we can identify around a topic that is of interest to them. We can identify their language issues and then develop language support that specifically addresses the issues that we have identified in that specific task that they are doing. And that, for me, that's what I'm calling therapy, so that we are not just teaching them grammar out of context or isolated forms of grammar, but we are teaching them grammar in the context of a creative piece that they have genuinely invested in. because that way they understand, they would learn that quicker because it helps them improve the work that they have genuinely involved, been engaged with. So I'm thinking about language that addresses those specific issues that emerge from the students' creative pieces, rather than superimposing grammar lessons that might not be relevant to their immediate needs.
Great. Okay. Right. I think we've got time for one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. And I've got two here. Let me have a look. So I've got a question here from Zora. Millions of thanks, Harry. I really appreciate your efforts. How do you engage lazy students who refuse to learn?
Right. Now that's a very important question. Now, one of the things I've said, and I agree this is very simplistic, I've always told teachers that I train, is that students are not stubborn, they are intellectually agitated. I am not too sure about lazy students. I don't think that they are lazy students. And I'm saying this because there is a difference that I believe that because someone is different from our idea of what they should be, that doesn't mean that they are not good enough. There are many shades of good, there are many shades of activeness. So I think what might happen is that students are not engaged in what we are doing because it's not interesting to them. Now, every student, every human being has something that is genuinely interesting to them. Now, getting that out of the student is one way of engaging them. Now, I'm not saying that we have to accept everything that students tell us, but we need to give them space to say what they really like to be involved in, and also to discuss that with each other, because they are social beings. I think they would engage more if they see that their idea is partly accepted, but also not fully accepted by the rest of the students. And they would also be engaged if they know that some ideas are coming from their colleagues. Now, imagine yourselves as teachers and a trainer coming to say, okay, you know nothing, I want to teach you this. Of course, we as adults want to be involved in making decisions about what we should learn or where we are starting from. Young learners also want that, students also want that. So opening up and talking to them might unlock their capacities, and we might just find that what we call lazy students are actually resistant because of a reason which is partly based on what we do and the lack of interest in what we are actually doing.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Harry, for a fantastic session. And thank you to everyone for joining us with such great questions for this very last session in our festival. So all that remains for me to do now is to close our festival and to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been involved, joined us this week, asked great questions. I've personally enjoyed every minute of it. And you've all made our festival a fantastic success. So thank you and goodbye.